What if the darkest secrets of a small town weren't just stories told in whispers, but curses that live and breathe, waiting to claim the next victim? In Coldwater, a forgotten covenant binds generations in a cycle of terror and sacrifice. Follow Simon as he unravels a haunting legacy, facing ancient spirits and unspeakable horrors that threaten not just his life, but the soul of the entire town. Brace yourself, this is a journey into a nightmare that doesn't end with dawn. Every old house holds a past, but the house on 32 Sycamore Street held something far darker, the echoes of those who never left. Simon Fletcher pulled his coat tighter against the chill as he stepped onto the cracked sidewalk of Coldwater, Montana. The town was a sleepy place, nestled among the endless stretches of pine forest and rolling hills that whispered secrets in the autumn wind. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and yet, as Simon looked around, he felt a curious emptiness. The streets were nearly deserted, the few scattered houses huddled beneath skeletal trees, shedding their dying leaves. A thin fog crept along the ground, wrapping the town in a muted gray shroud. Simon's breath came in soft clouds, his footsteps echoing in the quiet as he approached the house he had rented, number 32 Sycamore. The real estate agent had called it a quaint, historic property that needed a little TLC. Simon, freshly divorced and craving a fresh start away from the stifling memories of his old life in Seattle, had jumped at the chance to live somewhere peaceful, somewhere untouched by the chaos he'd left behind. But as he stood before the weathered wooden door, flaking paint revealing years of neglect, a shiver of unease crawled up his spine. The house was imposing despite its age, 2 stories tall, with narrow windows staring out like watchful eyes. The porch sagged, boards warped and cracked. The garden was a tangled mess of weeds and dead branches, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood and decay. Inside, the house groaned and creaked as if settling back into the world after a long slumber. Simon flipped the light switch, but the bulb flickered uncertainly before glowing dimly. Dust motes danced in the weak light, drifting like restless spirits. Boxes lay unopened in every corner, their contents forgotten by the previous occupants. Old newspapers yellowed with age, a faded photograph of a family smiling in front of the very house. In a half-finished painting propped against a wall, Simon's eyes lingered on the painting. It depicted a young boy with hollow eyes, his expression frozen between fear and sorrow. A name flashed, unbidden in Simon's mind. Daniel, his younger brother, who had vanished 20 years ago without a trace. The memory tightened around his chest, a wound still raw beneath the surface of his carefully constructed calm. He forced himself to shake it off, reminding himself he was here to start anew. He wandered through the rooms, the floorboards creaking underfoot, feeling the weight of decades pressing down around him. At the top of the stairs, he paused outside the attic door, half open, revealing shadows within. A chill seeped from the darkness, inviting and forbidding all at once. Simon pushed the door gently and stepped inside. The attic was cluttered with relics of the past, old trunks, rusted tools, moth-eaten blankets. But what caught his attention was the small, dust-covered window at the far end, through which the gray sky bled pale light. He moved closer and noticed something odd. Scrawled in faded charcoal on the wooden floorboards near the window was a series of strange symbols, half erased but unmistakable. They reminded Simon of the occult drawings he'd once seen in an old book on folklore. A ritual circle, perhaps, or a ward meant to keep something in or out. The sensation of being watched prickled at his skin. He turned sharply and froze. At the edge of the attic, where the slanting ceiling met the wall, a small door had been boarded up, its wooden surface scarred and patched. It looked out of place, too new and too deliberate. Heart hammering, Simon knelt and pressed his fingers against the rough wood. The smell of damp earth and something metallic drifted up. He frowned. Why seal off part of an attic? He left the door undisturbed for the moment and descended back to the main floor, where the house seemed to settle around him like a living thing. The evening light waned, casting long, sinister shadows that twisted and writhed across the walls. That night, Simon lay awake in the creaking bed, the silence pressing in on him. The house whispered, soft knocks at the walls, the scrape of wood against wood, the faintest of sighs. At one point, he thought he heard a child's laughter, faint and distant, echoing down the hallway. He bolted upright. "Get a grip, Simon," he muttered, swallowing hard. "It's just an old house." But sleep wouldn't come. At precisely 3:13 a.m., the bedroom window rattled violently, jolting Simon fully awake. His heart leapt into his throat. Through the pale moonlight, he glimpsed a shadow dart past the glass, swift, fleeting, and impossible to pin down. Unable to shake the feeling that he was no longer alone, Simon got up and moved cautiously through the house, every creak and groan magnified in the stillness. His feet carried him almost involuntarily toward the attic. The boarded-up door in the attic now stood slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped out, carrying with it a faint murmur. Simon's breath caught as he reached for the door and pulled it open. Behind it, a narrow staircase spiraled down into darkness. A pungent odor of earth and decay wafted up, making his stomach churn. He hesitated but felt a strange compulsion, a magnetic pull drawing him downward. Gripping the worn banister, he descended step by slow step into the blackness below. At the bottom, his flashlight flickered erratically, casting wild shadows on the rough stone walls. Ahead, a faint light glowed. A small room, barely larger than a closet. Simon stepped inside and froze. In the center of the room lay a circle of salt, cracked and disturbed. Within it, a leather-bound journal rested on a pile of ash. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped handwriting and strange symbols. His fingers trembled as he opened the journal. The first entry was dated 1897 and spoke of a coven that had once occupied the house, performing rituals to bind spirits within its walls. As he read, the hairs on his neck stood on end. Suddenly, a cold breeze extinguished his flashlight. Darkness swallowed him whole. He fumbled in the blackness, heart pounding, until the faint glow of a match revealed a figure standing at the doorway. A boy, pale and translucent, eyes hollow. "Simon," the boy whispered, voice barely audible. "You've come." Simon's mind reeled. The boy's face was unmistakable. Daniel. Terror flooded his veins. The attic door slammed shut upstairs. Simon awoke gasping, drenched in cold sweat, with mud smeared inexplicably across the floorboards beneath his bed. He stared, paralyzed. Had he really descended into the basement? Or had something dragged him into the darkness? Outside, the first light of dawn crept through the window, but the house remained shrouded in shadows, whispering secrets no one was meant to hear. Simon Fletcher was no longer sure if he had truly come to Coldwater for peace, or if he had walked straight into a nightmare that would never let him go. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy curtains, casting the room in a pale, reluctant light. Simon lay awake, the weight of last night's encounter pressing down on him like a shroud. His heart still raced, as if the boy's whisper, Daniel's whisper, lingered in his ears, refusing to fade. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, muscles stiff from the restless sleep. His gaze fell upon the mudstains trailing across the floorboards like dark veins. How had they gotten there? The dirt wasn't from anywhere in the house. It was fresh, earthy, the scent of damp forest soil lingering in the air. The forest just beyond the town, where Daniel had disappeared all those years ago. Simon tried to shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes tracked his every movement. The house itself seemed to breathe around him, alive with secrets and memories. He forced himself to focus. Today he would explore more thoroughly. Maybe answers lay hidden in the town, records, stories, anything that might explain what was happening here. After a quick breakfast at the local diner, Simon drove the narrow roads toward the Coldwater Historical Society. The building was an aging brick structure, its faded sign barely legible under peeling paint. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, a treasure trove of forgotten history. The curator, an elderly woman named Martha, eyed Simon with a mixture of curiosity and caution when he mentioned 32 Sycamore. "That place," she began slowly, "has a reputation. Folks round here don't like to talk about it much." Simon nodded. "I'm aware. But I need to know. My brother disappeared near there 20 years ago." Martha's eyes softened. "Daniel, yes, I remember. It was a tragedy no one could explain. She led Simon to a glass display case containing yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs. Among them was a mugshot of a man with sharp features and cold eyes, one of the town's founding members, Charles Marsh. According to Martha, Marsh had led a secretive group called the Coven of 13 Voices, active in the late 1800s. They practiced rituals intended to bind spirits to this world, using the power of names and memory. Their methods were brutal: sacrifices, chanting, and dark ceremonies deep in the forest. Simon's pulse quickened. The coven's rituals sounded eerily like the symbols he had found in the attic, and the strange markings etched into the floor. "People say the house itself listens," Martha whispered. "If you say a name, the house remembers, and it keeps those names, like prisoners." Simon shivered. He was beginning to see how the past and present tangled together like twisted roots beneath cold water. Back at the house, Simon felt the oppressive atmosphere tighten around him as dusk fell. He lit candles in every room, the flickering flames casting grotesque shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper. The house seemed to hum softly, as if whispering a warning. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy's face. Daniel's face, pale, hollow, and full of sorrow. It was as if the boy was trapped between worlds, caught in the same cycle that had swallowed so many before him. Simon found himself drawn again to the attic. The small boarded door called to him like a secret beckoning in the dark. This time, he brought his camera, determined to capture any evidence of the supernatural. The air grew colder as he ascended the stairs, each step echoing like a heartbeat. Opening the door revealed the narrow staircase descending into shadows. He turned on the flashlight and took a deep breath. The air below smelled of earth and old rot. His footsteps disturbed dust and debris as he moved carefully through the narrow passage. At the bottom, the same small room awaited, with the salt circle cracked and faded. The leather-bound journal lay where he had left it. Simon flipped through the pages, the script revealing increasingly disturbing entries. The coven had believed that by binding names to the house, they could trap souls and extend their own lives. But the ritual had backfired, imprisoning them all in a perpetual state of torment. Suddenly, a whisper floated from the shadows, a soft, mournful sigh, barely audible. Simon froze. "Daniel." The voice was his brother's. A chill coursed through Simon's veins. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through darkness, but found only empty stone walls. The house groaned, settling around him, but beneath the creaks and cracks, Simon thought he heard faint voices, whispers tangled with sorrow and fear. He fled the basement and slammed the attic door behind him, but the feeling of being followed clung to him like a second skin. Over the next few days, Simon's routine became a desperate search for clues and sanity. Coldwater's residents avoided him, their eyes wide with unspoken fears. At the local church, the priest spoke of blessings and curses, urging Simon to leave the house before it consumed him. But Simon's obsession only deepened. He discovered an old photograph hidden beneath loose floorboards in the living room, a faded group portrait of the Coven of 13 Voices, their faces grim, eyes hollow. Among them, a young woman held a book bound in worn leather, the same book he had seen glimpses of in the journal. That night, the house seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Simon lay awake, listening as the wind rattled the windows and strange scratching noises echoed in the walls. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the house fell silent. Then a low chanting began, distant but growing louder. Simon rose and crept down the hallway. The front door slammed shut behind him, locking him inside. He followed the chanting to the basement door, which now stood wide open. The cold breath of the darkness enveloped him as he descended. Inside the chamber, faint candlelight flickered. Shadows moved in the corners, shapes that vanished when he tried to focus. At the center of the room was a crude altar, stained with dark marks. The leather-bound book rested there, open to a page filled with names, some familiar, others unknown. Simon's eyes locked onto one name written in fresh ink: Simon Fletcher. A voice whispered behind him, "You're part of the covenant now." He spun to face a figure cloaked in shadow, its face hidden but eyes burning with unnatural fire. It rooted him to the spot as the voice continued. The house takes what it's owed. To break free, you must pay the price. Simon's mind raced. The ritual, the coven, the house, it was all connected. The house wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a prison for souls, a predator waiting to claim its next victim. With a sudden surge of will, Simon grabbed the book and bolted up the stairs, the chanting rising behind him like a tide. He slammed the basement door shut and pushed a heavy dresser against it. Panting, heart pounding, he looked around. The house was silent once more, but the dread lingered, suffocating and thick. He knew this was only the beginning. As he turned to leave the attic, his flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, the faint outline of a boy appeared. Daniel. Simon's blood ran cold. "Don't forget your name," the boy whispered. A cold hand brushed Simon's shoulder, and the door slammed shut. At precisely 3:13 a.m., the veil thins, the moment when the living and the dead brush against one another. Simon Fletcher's eyes snapped open in the pitch-black darkness of his bedroom. The old clock on the mantel chimed 3 times, the final bell echoing faintly through the silent house. His heart pounded, each beat heavy and urgent. The air was thick with a suffocating stillness, as if the very walls were holding their breath. He lay motionless, listening. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the usual creaks and groans of the house were muted, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on his chest. Then, faintly at first, he heard it. A low whispering, voices threading through the darkness, calling his name in mournful tones. Simon's breath hitched. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, swirling like a spectral chant. His skin prickled with cold. He forced himself to sit up, gripping the edge of the bed, his eyes searching the shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse around him. The air shifted suddenly. A chill swept through the room, and a flicker of pale light danced at the far corner. Shapes began to coalesce, ethereal forms gliding silently, faces blurred but filled with sorrow and longing. A boy stepped forward from the mist, his eyes hollow and burning with an otherworldly fire. "Daniel!" Simon's throat tightened. The apparition's lips parted, and a voice both familiar and alien filled the room. "Why did you come here, Simon? Why awaken what should remain forgotten?" Simon swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "I need answers. I need to know what happened to you, to all of you." Daniel's gaze bore into him, ancient and unyielding. "The house holds our names, our memories, but it demands a price." Suddenly, the room shifted. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, shadows thickening into tangible darkness. Simon's body tensed as the boy's form dissolved into a torrent of whispers, swirling around him like a storm of lost souls. The bedroom door creaked open, and cold fingers of air curled inside, chilling Simon to the bone. He stood, voice barely a whisper. "I won't be your next prisoner." But deep down, he knew the house had already marked him. The next morning, the town of Coldwater wore its usual veil of quiet unease. Simon's encounter at 3:13 a.m. left him shaken but resolute. He needed to understand the ritual, the voices, the bond tying the lost souls to the house, and to him. Driving through the winding roads that cut through the dense Appalachian woods, Simon made his way to the Coldwater Public Library. The building was modest, with a brick facade cloaked in ivy and windows fogged with age. Inside, the scent of old books and polished wood surrounded him, a refuge from the creeping dread that followed him like a shadow. Simon approached the local history section, rifling through brittle volumes and faded newspapers. He sought anything related to the Coven of 13 Voices, the mysterious disappearances tied to the Sycamore house and the rituals that had cursed the town. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher as Simon pieced together the grim puzzle. The Coven had thrived in secrecy, their rites designed to tether spirits to the mortal realm through an unholy ritual, performed precisely at 3:13 a.m., the witching hour, when the boundary between life and death blurred. The ritual required names, Simon learned, whispered into the darkness, bound by salt and blood. The house, an anchor for these souls, fed on the memories and fears of those trapped inside. Each new arrival became part of the coven's eternal prison. Simon's fingers trembled as he traced the name Daniel Fletcher in an old ledger, listed among those who had vanished without explanation. His brother's fate was sealed not just by disappearance, but by becoming one with the house's curse. He left the library with a heavy heart but a flicker of determination. To break the cycle, he needed to confront the house and the ritual head on. Back at 32 Sycamore, the atmosphere thickened with unease. Simon's footsteps echoed through the empty rooms as he prepared for another night trapped within these walls. The house groaned under the weight of its own dark history, the shadows growing longer with each passing hour. As night fell, Simon set up candles in every corner, their flickering light casting eerie, dancing silhouettes. He reviewed the journal he had found, studying the ritual's details. The timing was critical. The ritual began at 3:13 a.m. and lasted precisely 13 minutes. Interrupting it could mean freedom, or something far worse. He waited. The clock ticked slowly toward the witching hour. At exactly 3:13, the house seemed to inhale, the air thick with spectral energy. Whispered voices rose in a haunting chorus, chanting words in a language long forgotten. The candles flickered wildly as the temperature plummeted. Simon's skin prickled as the ethereal figures materialized once more, circling the room with mournful grace. Faces twisted in eternal torment reached out with translucent hands, pleading for release. Among them, Daniel appeared, his eyes locked on Simon. "You must say their names," he urged. "Only then can the ritual be broken." Simon's mouth went dry. The journal had warned against speaking aloud the names, yet the alternative was endless torment. Taking a deep breath, Simon began to speak. One by one, he called out the names inscribed in the journal, those of the coven members, the vanished townsfolk, the forgotten souls trapped within the house. Each name echoed with a heavy weight, and with every utterance, the house trembled. The spirits' cries grew louder, a cacophony of anguish and hope. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the chant. The shadowy figure cloaked in fire and smoke, the embodiment of the curse itself, emerged from the darkness. Its eyes blazed with fury, and its voice rumbled like thunder. "Who dares defy the covenant?" Simon's heart pounded. The entity advanced, tendrils of darkness reaching toward him. Fear surged through his veins, yet he stood firm, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The battle between light and shadow waged fiercely in that cursed room. The spirits wailed, torn between liberation and servitude. The house shook violently, dust falling from the ceiling like ash. At last, with a desperate cry, Simon shouted the final name. Silence. The oppressive darkness receded, replaced by a fragile dawn light filtering through the cracked windows. The spirits faded, their expressions finally peaceful. Simon collapsed to his knees, trembling but alive. Yet, as relief washed over him, a cold whisper brushed against his ear. 3:13 is only the beginning. The morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of Simon Fletcher's room, painting long stripes of pale gold across the dust-laden floor. Yet, despite the calm exterior of the day, the shadows of the previous night's ordeal clung to Simon like a second skin, an invisible weight pressing against his chest. He moved slowly, each step heavy with exhaustion and unease. The house was silent now, but Simon knew better than to trust that stillness. He had stared into the abyss and seen the faces of the lost, heard their endless laments weaving through the walls like a poison mist. With the ritual seemingly broken, at least for now, Simon wrestled with a fragile hope. Yet deep inside, a gnawing doubt whispered, had he really freed them, or merely delayed something far worse? As he descended the stairs, the familiar creaks and groans of the old house seemed somehow louder, more urgent, as if the very wood and plaster resented the disturbance. Outside, the forest pressed in close, the trees' skeletal branches scratching the gray sky like clawed fingers. He tried to focus on mundane tasks, fixing the broken window latch, clearing the cluttered kitchen, but the house's oppressive aura seeped into every corner, poisoning his thoughts. A sudden knock at the door jolted him. Simon opened it cautiously, revealing Sheriff Dale Morgan, a grizzled man with a weathered face and eyes like cold steel. "I heard about the strange noises last night," Dale said, stepping inside without invitation. "Town's been talking. Folks say you're stirring up old ghosts." Simon nodded, wary but determined. "I'm trying to understand. This house, it's tied to something terrible. The coven, the ritual, it's all real." Dale's gaze sharpened. "Coldwater's full of stories like that. But I'll tell you this, those woods hide more than just old legends. People go missing. Some never come back. That house, it's cursed, Simon. You'd do best to leave it alone." Simon's jaw tightened. "Leaving isn't an option. Not until I find out what happened to Daniel." Dale sighed, eyes flickering with a mixture of sympathy and warning. "Just be careful. The past doesn't rest easy here." After Dale left, Simon's thoughts spiraled back to the ritual and the haunting words that lingered like a curse. 313 is only the beginning. That night, he set up an array of cameras and audio recorders throughout the house, determined to capture any evidence of the supernatural. The hours ticked by, shadows stretching and twisting in the candlelight. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the house seemed to exhale, a cold breath swirling through the rooms. The faint chanting resumed, more urgent this time, threading through the air like spectral fingers. Simon gripped the journal, reading aloud the names again. The spirits appeared, swirling in a maelstrom of sorrow and rage, faces contorted by centuries of pain. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, the candles extinguished as if snuffed by an unseen hand. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed from the shadows. "You dare defy the covenant twice?" The entity from before emerged, larger and more terrifying, a living shadow that consumed light. Simon stood his ground, chanting names faster, the words spilling from his lips in a desperate attempt to hold the darkness at bay. The entity howled, recoiling yet relentless. Then, through the chaos, a sudden calm, a whisper that cut through the noise. "Find the voice of the last. Break the chain." Simon's mind raced. The journal mentioned a final voice, a key to ending the curse. But who or what was it? In the flickering shadows, a small figure appeared. A woman, translucent and glowing faintly. Her eyes were ancient, filled with sorrow and resolve. "You seek the truth," she said, voice like wind through dead leaves. "But beware, the cost is more than you know." Before Simon could ask more, the room shook violently. The house screamed, walls cracking, dust raining down. Suddenly, the basement door flew open with a crash. From the darkness, something unseen surged upward. A cold wave of despair and menace. Simon stumbled back, heart pounding, as the lights flickered erratically. The voices around him grew frantic, overlapping in a terrible chorus. And then, silence. Days passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. Simon barely left the house, poring over the journal and local records, trying to unravel the tangled web of the coven's history. The townsfolk remained distant, their eyes shadowed with unspoken dread. Even Sheriff Dale avoided him, offering only grim warnings. Simon's dreams were haunted by visions, endless corridors twisting into darkness, faces staring from mirrors that shattered without warning, whispers promising freedom but demanding sacrifice. One afternoon, as he wandered the overgrown garden behind the house, Simon stumbled upon a buried wooden box, half swallowed by roots and earth. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, lay a collection of brittle letters and a small carved talisman. The letters, penned in trembling script, were from a woman named Evelyn Marsh, the coven's last known victim, who had tried to expose the ritual before disappearing. Her words spoke of terror beyond imagining, of voices that followed her, and of a final hope buried beneath the house. The talisman was inscribed with symbols matching those in the attic and journal, a protective charm, or perhaps a key. Simon felt the weight of history settle on his shoulders. To break the curse, he needed to uncover Evelyn's fate and confront the darkness that had claimed her. That night, the house's malevolent energy intensified. Shadows writhed along the walls, and faint cries echoed through the halls. At 3:13 a.m., Simon stood in the center of the living room, clutching the talisman and journal. He began to recite the ritual anew, this time weaving in the symbols from Evelyn's letters, hoping to sever the final bond. The temperature plummeted, breath visible in the air. The entity appeared again, furious and desperate. Simon's voice wavered but grew stronger, calling out the names, invoking the protective charm. The room shook violently as spectral forms surged and retreated. Suddenly, the floor beneath Simon's feet cracked open, revealing a dark abyss swirling with shadow. A chilling hand shot out, grasping for him. Simon barely pulled back, heart hammering. A whisper echoed from the darkness, promising release or eternal damnation. As the abyss pulsed with darkness, the attic window shattered, and cold winds swept through the room, scattering papers and extinguishing candles. Simon was left standing in the cold, darkness pressing in from all sides. The curse was not broken. It was awakening. The night had fallen like a heavy curtain over Coldwater, swallowing the fading light of dusk and replacing it with a suffocating blackness. Simon Fletcher sat by the cracked window of 32 Sycamore, his eyes fixed on the twisted silhouette of the ancient forest that hemmed in the town. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The forest remembers. The thought echoed relentlessly in Simon's mind, a sinister mantra binding past to present. Every story he had uncovered, every whisper of the Coven of 13 Voices, seemed to lead back here, to the tangled, shadowed woods that hid secrets older than the town itself. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the worn symbols etched into the edge of the windowsill, their shapes twisted and arcane. The protective talisman lay on the table beside him, its carved surface cold and unyielding, yet it offered no comfort. The air inside the house had thickened again, charged with unseen energy. Simon could feel it, a low humming vibration coursing through the floorboards, the walls, the very foundation beneath his feet. The house was alive, watching, waiting. His thoughts were shattered by a sudden knock at the door. Heart racing, Simon rose and moved cautiously to open it. Outside stood Martha, the elderly curator from the Historical Society, her eyes shadowed but resolute. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," she said quietly. "The forest isn't just trees, it's a gate, and something has crossed through." Simon nodded grimly. "I need to understand. If the ritual failed, if the curse is waking, I have to face it." Marta's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you'll need help. Come with me." They drove in silence through the winding back roads to the edge of the forest. There, nestled beneath towering oaks, was a small clearing, dominated by a weathered stone altar, half swallowed by moss and vines. It pulsed faintly with a spectral glow. "This was where the Coven performed their final ritual," Marta explained. "A place where the veil between worlds is thinnest. If you want to break the curse, it begins here." Simon stepped forward, heart pounding. The forest seemed to hold its breath, shadows deepening into a tangible darkness that pressed against his skin. As he reached out to touch the altar, the ground trembled beneath them. The air rippled with an unseen force, and the chanting began. Soft, mournful, growing louder, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. From the darkness emerged figures, twisted and ethereal. The lost souls of the Coven, their faces contorted with anguish, their eyes pleading for release. Simon swallowed hard and raised the talisman. The glow intensified, casting the clearing in a surreal light. He began to recite the incantations from Evelyn Marsh's letters, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his throat. The spirits writhed and moaned, caught between worlds, struggling against invisible chains. The forest echoed with their cries. Suddenly, a dark shape burst from the shadows, a towering figure cloaked in smoke and flame, eyes burning like coals. The embodiment of the curse itself, it roared, shaking the earth. Simon stood firm, chanting louder, the talisman blazing with light. The shadow recoiled but pressed forward, tendrils of darkness reaching to snuff out the glow. The battle of wills raged beneath the ancient trees. Simon's voice wavered but did not falter. With a final cry, he shouted the names of the coven one last time, the talisman flaring like a beacon. The shadows screamed, dissipating into a swirl of black mist. The spirits lifted, faces serene as they faded into the dawn. The forest exhaled, the veil mending. Simon collapsed to the ground, breathless but victorious, at least for now. Yet as the first light of day kissed the treetops, a whisper stirred in the wind, cold and cruel. The covenant is eternal. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Simon found himself back in the house, the weight of the night's ordeal pressing down with unbearable heaviness. The clearing in the forest, the altar, the chanting spirits, all of it had felt like a victory. But victory came with a price. Simon knew the covenant's grip was far from broken. It was a hydra, its head growing anew with every strike. Inside 32 Sycamore, the air was colder than before, carrying a bitterness that seemed to seep from the very wood. Simon sat at the kitchen table, clutching the worn journal that had become both his guide and his burden. The pages were stained with time and despair, detailing rites, names, and warnings he could barely comprehend fully yet. His mind raced back to Evelyn Marsh's letters, the last desperate words of a woman who had understood too much, suffered too deeply. The truth behind the ritual was far darker than he had imagined. The coven had not merely bound spirits. They had anchored a piece of themselves, and something older, darker, thrived in that tether. Suddenly, a low thud echoed through the house. Simon's head snapped up, eyes scanning the shadows. The sound came again, soft, deliberate footsteps moving slowly along the hall. He reached instinctively for the talisman lying on the counter. From the darkness of the hallway emerged a figure, faint, barely there, a silhouette with flickering edges, the ghostly form of a woman. Her eyes, deep wells of sorrow, stared at him with a mixture of fear and pleading. "Simon." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it pierced the silence. "You have awakened something ancient. It is not enough to break the chain. You must confront the source." Simon swallowed hard, heart pounding. "Who are you?" "Marian," she said, stepping closer but fading like mist. "I was one of them, bound by the covenant. The source lies beneath this house, in the cellar where the coven's final ritual was performed." Simon's breath hitched. The cellar had always been locked, barred with heavy chains and cryptic symbols scrawled across the door. Until now, he had avoided it, fear and superstition holding him back. Marian's form flickered and dissipated, leaving a chilling silence in her wake. Simon knew what he had to do. Descending the creaking stairs, he approached the cellar door. The symbols burned faintly in the dying light, a warning and a challenge. With trembling hands, he traced the carvings, whispering the incantations from the journal. The chains fell away with a metallic clang, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Simon flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through thick dust and cobwebs. The air was damp and heavy with decay. The stone walls bore scratches and ancient markings, glowing faintly with a malevolent light. At the base of the stairs lay a circular chamber, its center dominated by a stone altar stained with dried blood. Simon's gaze fixed on a leather-bound book resting atop the altar, the Coven's Grimoire. Opening it, he found pages filled with arcane scripts and diagrams of rituals that bent the natural order. The final ritual was meant to tether souls for eternity, but a darker secret was hidden within. A pact made with an entity older than the town, a creature of shadow and fire bound by blood and sacrifice. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply. Simon's breath became visible in the freezing air as shadows writhed along the walls, coalescing into the form of the Covenant's guardian. A towering figure of smoke and embers, its eyes burning with wrath. "You meddle with forces beyond your understanding," it intoned, voice like grinding stone. "The Covenant demands its due." Simon steadied himself, clutching the talisman and the grimoire. "I will end this. No more sacrifices, no more souls trapped." The entity laughed, a sound like cracking ice, and lunged forward. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, forcing Simon to dive behind the altar, The chamber shook violently as light and shadow clashed. Recalling Evelyn's writings, Simon began a counter-ritual, chanting words of binding and release, inscribed with the protective symbols of the talisman. The creature shrieked, recoiling, but its fury grew, shaking the very stones beneath them. Simon's voice faltered, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him, but he pressed on, knowing this was the moment of truth. Suddenly, a brilliant flash engulfed the chamber. The entity's form shattered like glass, fragments of shadow dissolving into nothingness. The chamber fell silent. Simon sank to his knees, gasping for breath, the grimoire slipping from his fingers. But relief was short-lived. From the deepest darkness of the cellar, a new whisper slithered through the air. Cold, sinister, promising. You may have broken the chain, but the covenant remains. The final voice will call again. Simon's heart froze. Above, the house creaked ominously, and from the walls, unseen eyes seemed to watch. The covenant was not over. The air was thick with fog as dawn struggled to pierce through the dense canopy of Appalachian pines surrounding the town of Coldwater. Simon Fletcher's boots crunched on the damp undergrowth, each step reverberating with a mix of dread and determination. The morning mist curled around his ankles like ghostly fingers, pulling him back toward a nightmare that refused to loosen its grip. He paused at the edge of a small clearing where the remains of an old church stood, half swallowed by vines and decay. Its steeple was jagged and broken, like a claw clawing at the sky. The building was draped in shadows despite the growing light, a silent testament to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Simon tightened his grip on the leather-bound journal tucked beneath his arm. The last nights had drained him, but now he was faced with the next step in the twisted journey, confronting the roots of the Covenant's curse. Hidden in this forsaken sanctuary, the town's whispered legends spoke of the church as a focal point for the Coven's rituals, where blood was spilt and ancient rites were enacted to bind spirits and seal dark pacts. The old folk called it the Sanctum of Whispers, a place where prayers twisted into curses and salvation turned to damnation. Simon pushed open the heavy wooden door, its rusted hinges groaning like a beast disturbed from slumber. Inside, the air was stale and cold, smelling of rot and old ash. Broken pews lay scattered. Shattered stained glass filtered fractured beams of light, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the cracked stone floor. He moved cautiously, the journal in hand illuminating faded inscriptions etched into the altar. The symbols were familiar, runes of protection mingled with sigils of binding, the tangled language of ritual magic. Somewhere here lay the key to severing the covenant once and for all. Suddenly, a distant whisper echoed through the nave, faint but unmistakable. Simon's pulse quickened as the voices grew clearer, chanting in a tongue that twisted his tongue and chilled his soul. Ego te absolvo, ego te libero. He traced the source to a shadowed alcove near the altar, where an ancient tome lay open on a lectern, its pages fluttering despite the absence of wind. A security tome, unlike any other Denise had ever seen. How could she see such a place? Until the script was indecipherable, but an ominous energy radiated from the book like a living thing. Simon's hands trembled as he reached out, hesitating. A cold presence brushed past him, like a sigh of despair. Then the chamber shifted. The stained glass shattered simultaneously, showering the floor with shards that gleamed like fragmented souls. A low growl rumbled from the shadows. From the darkness emerged a figure, an apparition clad in tattered robes, face obscured by a veil of darkness. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing an accusing finger. "You dare desecrate the sanctum?" Simon swallowed hard, but met the apparition's gaze steadily. "I seek to end the curse." The ghost's hollow voice echoed with centuries of pain. "The covenant feeds on despair, binds through blood. To break it, you must pay the price." The floor beneath Simon's feet trembled as the walls seemed to pulse, alive with malevolent intent. Shadows coalesced into writhing shapes, faces contorted in silent screams. Simon gripped the journal tightly, reciting the protective prayers learned from Evelyn's letters, weaving light through the growing darkness. But the specters advanced, reaching out with ethereal claws. A sudden flash of insight struck Simon. The sanctuary was not just a place of past ritual, but a living nexus of power, its roots entangled with the land itself. To sever the covenant, he had to destroy its source, buried deep beneath the church. The earth holds the covenant's heart, but beware, the price is steep, and not all who enter return. Simon's breath caught. He was already too far to turn back. Behind the altar, a trapdoor lay hidden beneath a threadbare rug, its edges worn and camouflaged. He knelt and pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Taking a deep breath, Simon descended into the cold abyss. The walls here were slick with moisture, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Ancient roots snaked along the stone, pulsing faintly with a sickly glow. At the bottom, a cavernous chamber opened, a subterranean sanctuary carved from living rock. In its center, a massive stone heart throbbed slowly, veins of crimson light pulsing outward. The heart was bound by chains of bone and metal, sigils glowing fiercely on their surface. Around it, relics of the coven's power were scattered, bones, talismans, blood-stained cloth. Simon approached cautiously, feeling the oppressive weight of the curse pressing down on him. The journal's pages fluttered open to a passage describing a ritual of unbinding, requiring the destruction of the heart. But before he could act, a voice hissed from the shadows. "You cannot undo what was forged in blood." From the darkness, the entity materialized, taller, more terrifying than before, a living shadow wreathed in flames, eyes burning with ancient fury. Simon steadied himself, clutching the talisman and the journal. The entity lunged, tendrils of darkness whipping through the air, aiming to snuff out the fragile light Simon carried. Dodging swiftly, Simon began the ritual, chanting words of unbinding, the talisman flaring with blinding brilliance. The heart pulsed violently, chains rattling as the cavern shook. The battle of wills intensified, light clashing with shadow, ancient magic against desperate hope. With a final cry, Simon shattered the chains binding the heart. The cavern erupted in a maelstrom of light and darkness, the pulse slowing, then fading. The heart cracked, splintering into shards that dissolved into dust. The oppressive weight lifted, the curse's grip loosening. Simon stumbled back, gasping, sweat and tears mingling on his face. But as the light filled the chamber, a whisper drifted through the air, a final, chilling vow. This is only the beginning. The silence that followed the shattering of the cursed heart was deafening, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Simon stumbled upward from the subterranean chamber, each step heavier than the last. The air in the church seemed to pulse with a fragile hope, yet beneath that faint light lingered an unsettling truth. Somewhere, deep in the shadows of Coldwater, something was still watching. Emerging into the decaying sanctuary, Simon's legs threatened to give way beneath him. The weight of exhaustion mingled with the cold sweat of fear. He had broken the chains, shattered the heart of the covenant's curse, but at what cost? The ground beneath the church trembled faintly, a reminder that the battle was far from over. Outside, the sky was bruised with twilight, the first stars flickering to life beyond the oppressive canopy. Simon's breath caught as he felt a presence at the edge of the clearing, a slow, deliberate watching. He turned toward the woods, heart pounding, but saw only shifting shadows. Still, he knew the forest harbored ancient eyes, waiting for the moment to strike back. Back in town, the air was thick with unease. The townsfolk of Coldwater whispered rumors of flickering lights in the forest, strange howls echoing in the night, and the lingering chill of something unnatural. Sheriff Thompson, a grizzled man with decades in the county, had begun his own investigation, piecing together old records and local folklore. Simon knew he needed allies. At 32 Sycamore, Simon pored over the journal and Evelyn Marsh's letters, desperate for answers. Every page hinted at a deeper ritual, one that had bound the curse not just to the land, but to the very bloodline of the town's founders, a dark inheritance passed down through generations. Feeding the covenant's power, his mind spiraled with questions. How many had been sacrificed? How many lives had been twisted to feed this darkness? And now that he had severed the heart, would the curse find another vessel? Suddenly, a soft knock at the door startled him. Opening it revealed Martha, her face pale but resolute. "I've been speaking with the sheriff," she said quietly. "There are things you need to know. The Covenant's influence goes deeper than you realize. It's woven into Coldwater's very fabric." Simon stepped aside, letting her in. The two sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the walls. "Legend speaks of the final voice," Martha began, her voice low, "a last remnant of the Covenant's power, sealed away in the old mill by the river. If that voice awakens, the curse will reignite with vengeance." Simon's pulse quickened. The mill had always been avoided by the locals, a place of whispered warnings and dark tales. If the final voice stirred, time was running out. That night, restless and haunted, Simon dreamt of the forest once more. The trees whispered secrets in tongues he almost understood. Faces appeared in the shadows, some pleading, some accusing, others twisted with rage. He awoke gasping, a cold sweat soaking his sheets. Days blurred as Simon prepared for the next step, gathering supplies and steeling his resolve. The weight of the town's fate pressed upon him, but so did the fragile hope that he might finally end this nightmare. At dawn, he made his way toward the old mill, the journal clutched tightly. The path was overgrown, nature reclaiming the ruins with creeping vines and moss-covered stones. The mill's skeletal frame stood like a monument to forgotten horrors, its broken windows staring like empty eye sockets. Inside, the air was thick with rot and stale water. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet as he ventured deeper, the sound swallowed by an unnatural silence. Then, a low hum vibrated through the air, growing louder with each step. Simon's breath caught, an eerie melody weaving through the ruins, chilling and hypnotic. At the center of the mill, encased in a cage of rusted iron, lay an ancient artifact, a crystalline orb pulsing with an inner light, casting eerie reflections on the walls. Simon reached out, the orb's energy thrumming beneath his fingertips. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, low, commanding, and filled with malice. "You dare awaken me?" The final voice manifested, an apparition both beautiful and terrifying, shifting between human and monstrous forms. Its eyes burned with an infernal fire. Simon tightened his grip on the talisman, reciting protective incantations. The orb's glow intensified, bathing the room in an unholy light. The final voice laughed, a sound that rippled through the bones of the mill. "You may have shattered the heart, but the Covenant's song never dies. I am the last chorus, the eternal echo." The chamber trembled as dark tendrils of energy surged forth, weaving a cage of shadow around Simon. Panic surged, but he fought the paralysis, calling upon every ounce of strength. The struggle was fierce, a clash of wills as Simon chanted the counter-ritual, the talisman blazing. The final voice shrieked, its form fracturing and reforming, desperate to maintain its hold. With a final cry, Simon shattered the orb against the stone floor. Light exploded, consuming the shadows, and the apparition dissolved into a cascade of sparks. Silence followed, but as Simon caught his breath, a whisper curled around him, soft, sinister, and unrelenting. "The Covenant's song is never truly silenced." He staggered out of the mill, the night air heavy with an ominous promise. The town of Coldwater slept uneasily, unaware that the darkest chapter was yet to come. The wind howled through the skeletal trees of Coldwater as dusk fell, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something far more sinister. Simon Fletcher stood at the edge of town, staring at the horizon where the last slivers of daylight fought desperately against the encroaching darkness. The past days had left him drained, but the fight was far from over. The Covenant's final song had been broken, or so he thought. Now a new dread settled deep in his bones. The whispers that haunted the night had grown louder, threading through the townsfolk's dreams and waking moments alike. Shadows moved just beyond sight, and the once familiar streets twisted into something unrecognizable, a reflection of the curse's lingering taint. Simon's footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement as he made his way back to 32 Sycamore. The house greeted him like an old wound, aching and raw. Inside, the air was thick with stale memories and unspoken fears. The journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages yellowed and fragile, a map through the darkness. He sank into a worn chair, rubbing his temples. The journal's recent entries hinted at a lingering presence, a seed of corruption planted deep in the heart of the town. The covenant might have been shattered, but its legacy had taken root, spreading like poison through the veins of cold water. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. Simon's heart jumped as he rose cautiously. Opening it revealed Sheriff Thompson, his face grim and lined with worry. "We've got trouble," the sheriff said, stepping inside. "People are disappearing. Strange marks have been found near the old cemetery, and some swear they've seen figures moving in the fog." Simon nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavier. The curse was not done with them, not by a long shot. Together, they pored over local records and whispered testimonies. The old cemetery, long neglected, had become a nexus of fear. Graves disturbed, shadows flitting between the tombstones, and a creeping sense of menace that seeped into the bones of anyone who dared linger. Determined to confront this new threat, Simon gathered supplies: herbs, salt, protective charms, and prepared to face the darkness once more. The night was moonless as he stepped into the cemetery, the mist curling around the ancient stones like a living shroud. Each breath was visible, hanging in the cold air like a fragile thread between life and death. Silence pressed in, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of dry leaves. Simon moved steadily, tracing the perimeter where the strange marks had been found. Symbols etched deep into the earth, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Suddenly, the air shifted. A chill raced down Simon's spine as shapes emerged from the fog, figures draped in tattered robes, faces obscured by shadows. The ghosts of the Covenant's victims, trapped between worlds, their eyes hollow wells of sorrow and rage. They surrounded him, their whispers a cacophony of sorrow and accusation. "Release us," they pleaded. "Break the chains." Simon's voice was steady despite the fear. "I will end this." He began the rite, the same ritual Eveling had described, casting salt and herbs, drawing protective circles, chanting words of release and binding. The spirits writhed, their forms flickering between the ethereal and the corporal, some reaching out with desperate hands, others screaming in anguish. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the ground beneath the cemetery trembled. From the earth rose a monstrous figure, a twisted amalgamation of shadow and bone, the physical embodiment of the Covenant's wrath. Simon stood his ground, talisman glowing fiercely in his hand. The creature roared, its voice a terrible symphony of pain and fury. The battle was fierce and unforgiving, light and shadow clashing in a deadly dance. Summoning every ounce of strength, Simon unleashed the ritual's final incantation. The creature faltered, then shattered into shards of darkness that dissolved into the night. The spirits sighed, their forms softening into peaceful light before fading into the ether. Exhausted but victorious, Simon knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The Covenant's curse had left scars on the land, on the people, and within himself. As he turned to leave the cemetery, a cold breeze whispered through the trees, carrying a warning. The Covenant's last secret was yet to be revealed, and its price would be higher than anyone dared imagine. The morning light seeped hesitantly through the grimy windows of 32 Sycamore, casting long, uneasy shadows across the worn wooden floor. Simon awoke with a start, the residue of restless dreams clinging stubbornly to his mind. The nightmares had become more vivid, dark corridors lined with whispering faces, hands reaching out from the cracks, voices pleading, warning, accusing. He shook off the remnants of sleep, knowing he could not afford the luxury of rest. Coldwater was restless, and so was he. The town's unease had become palpable. People spoke in hushed tones of flickering lights, unexplained disappearances, and an oppressive presence that seemed to thicken the very air. Even Sheriff Thompson's usual stoic calm had been cracked by the recent events, his tired eyes shadowed with worry. Simon had spent the previous night poring over the journal, tracing lines of ink that hinted at a final secret buried deep within Coldwater's past, a secret older and darker than even the Covenant itself. The town's founding families had long carried the burden of an ancient pact, a binding ritual whispered in forbidden tongues and sealed with blood and sacrifice. Now, Simon faced the grim reality. Breaking the Covenant's heart and silencing the final voice had only stirred a deeper darkness, one that threatened to consume everything he had fought to protect. Determined to confront this emerging terror, Simon joined Sheriff Thompson and a small group of trusted townsfolk at the edge of the forest bordering Coldwater. Their destination was the old crypt, a moss-covered mausoleum long sealed and shunned by locals. It was said to be the resting place of the town's original founders and the source of a lingering curse that tied the Covenant's fate to Coldwater's soil. As they approached, an unnatural silence fell over the woods, as if the forest itself held its breath. The crypt's stone door stood ajar, revealing a yawning darkness that seemed to swallow the weak beam of their flashlights. "Stay close," Simon warned, gripping the talisman hidden beneath his coat. "This place is steeped in the old magic, the ritual binding. If the curse is still alive, it's here." The group stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. The walls were carved with symbols that pulsed faintly with eldritch energy, their ancient power humming beneath the surface. Simon's heart hammered as memories of Evelyn's warnings echoed in his mind. The ritual that bound the founders' souls had a fail-safe, a trap set to activate should the Covenant ever be challenged. Deeper into the crypt, they found the sarcophagi, stone coffins etched with the names of Coldwater's progenitors. Each bore a sigil of protection, intertwined with a curse, binding their spirits eternally. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. Shadows peeled from the walls, coalescing into forms, ghostly figures clad in tattered finery, their eyes hollow voids of sorrow and rage. The crypt filled with a chorus of mournful wails as the spirits of the founders rose, their voices weaving a lament that chilled the marrow. "You trespass where the living must not tread," one intoned, a spectral leader stepping forward. "The Covenant's price is eternal. Leave or join us in the endless night." Simon steadied himself, voice firm. "I seek only to end the curse that binds this town in darkness." The spirits recoiled, their faces contorted in anguish and fury. "To undo the Covenant, you must confront the heart of our sacrifice, a relic buried beneath the crypt's altar. But beware, mortal. The cost is greater than you imagine." Guided by flickering torchlight, Simon and the sheriff descended through a hidden trapdoor beneath the altar, entering a subterranean chamber suffused with a sickly green glow. At its center lay an ancient relic, a twisted, pulsating idol carved from blackened bone and veined with crimson light. The room throbbed with a malevolent energy that seeped into Simon's bones, whispering promises of power and ruin. He approached cautiously, clutching the talisman. As he neared, spectral hands erupted from the walls, grasping and clawing, desperate to prevent his advance. With a guttural cry, Simon invoked the protective chants, the talisman flaring with searing light that repelled the phantom graspers. Sweat dripped down his brow as he reached for the idol, his fingers trembling. The moment he touched the relic, the chamber convulsed violently. The idol pulsed fiercely, releasing a shockwave of dark energy that threw Simon and the others to the floor. As the dust settled, a dreadful realization dawned. The Covenant was not merely a curse. It was a living, breathing entity, entwined with the souls of Coldwater's ancestors and the land itself. Destroying the idol meant severing that bond, but risked awakening a power older and more terrible than anyone could foresee. Simon rose, determined. With steady hands, he raised a consecrated dagger, its blade gleaming with ancient runes. As he prepared to shatter the idol, the walls whispered secrets of blood and sacrifice, the price of salvation. Suddenly, a blinding flash engulfed the chamber. When Simon's vision cleared, he found himself alone. The relic was shattered, splinters of bone and light scattered across the stone floor. The oppressive energy lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. Yet the silence was broken by a faint whisper, a voice carried on a cold wind, echoing through the crypt's depths. "You have freed us, but the covenant's shadow remains. The true price is yet to come." Simon's heart sank. The battle might be over, but the war had just begun. As he ascended the narrow staircase back to the surface, a sudden chill swept through the crypt. Behind him, unseen eyes glowed in the dark, watching, waiting. Emerging into the dawn's pale light, Simon knew that whatever lay ahead, Coldwater would never be the same, and neither would he. The night wrapped Coldwater in an unnatural silence, the kind that pressed against the skin and seeped into the bones. Simon stood alone on the edge of the town, his breath shallow and sharp in the cold air. The sky above was a canvas of thick clouds, hiding any trace of moonlight, as if the darkness itself wanted to swallow the world whole. This was the moment, the reckoning that he had dreaded since the beginning. The covenant shadow still loomed, twisting and whispering, refusing to fade. Simon knew that whatever price he had paid to break the curse was only the beginning of a longer, darker path. His footsteps carried him back to 32 Sycamore, where the weight of the past and the unknown future bore down on him like a physical force. Inside the house, the air felt heavier than ever, thick with memories and lingering dread. The journal lay on the table, its pages fluttering in a silent breeze, as if urging him onward. As Simon pored over the final entries, the lines blurred into a chilling message. The curse was cyclical, a never-ending ritual bound to the town's fate. Breaking the idol and confronting the spirits had not freed Coldwater, they had only postponed the inevitable. Suddenly, a faint knock echoed at the door. Simon's pulse quickened. Opening it revealed Martha, her eyes wide with urgency. "They're coming back," she whispered. "The old spirits. They've gathered, stronger than ever." Simon nodded grimly. There was no time left to hesitate. Together they ventured into the forest where the Covenant's power had first taken root. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath was soft and cold, a carpet of fallen leaves muffling their footsteps. As they approached the clearing, a low hum vibrated through the air, a haunting melody that wrapped around their hearts and pulled them deeper into the dark. From the shadows emerged the Covenant's remnants, ghostly figures draped in tattered robes, their faces pale masks of sorrow and rage. They circled a stone altar cracked with age and stained with forgotten blood. Simon stepped forward, voice steady despite the rising fear. "This ends tonight. No more sacrifice, no more chains." The spirits wailed, a mournful chorus that rattled the trees. From the altar, a dark mist rose, coalescing into a towering figure, a twisted, malevolent entity forged from the collective agony of the town's ancestors. The battle that followed was brutal and unrelenting. Simon and Martha fought with every ounce of will, wielding the knowledge and rituals they had uncovered. The air crackled with raw energy as light clashed against shadow, each strike shaking the earth. In the heart of the storm, Simon saw a flicker of vulnerability in the entity. Summoning his courage, he chanted the final binding spell, the words burning in his throat. The entity screamed, a sound that tore through the night like shattered glass and shattered into a cascade of fading light. As silence fell, Simon sank to his knees, exhausted but victorious. The curse was broken, its grip finally lifted. Yet, as dawn broke over Coldwater, a single black feather drifted through the air, settling softly on Simon's shoulder. A silent reminder that some shadows never fully fade. The first light of dawn barely pierced the heavy gray clouds as Simon and Martha stumbled back toward the town, their bodies aching from the battle, their minds heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The forest behind them seemed to shudder with a final breath, as if exhaling centuries of dark sorrow and malice that had long gripped Coldwater. But peace was not yet theirs. The town lay quiet, deceptively calm, but Simon's eyes caught the telltale signs of lingering dread, the shuttered windows, the vacant stares of those who lingered in shadows, and the palpable fear that clung to every whispered word. They were survivors, but survivors of what? And for how long? Simon's heart thudded with a growing unease. The binding ritual had shattered the malevolent entity, yes, but the curse, the ancient covenant, was not simply a creature to be destroyed. It was a living legacy, woven into the very fabric of Coldwater's existence, feeding on the fear and pain of its people. Martha's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "We need to warn them. They don't understand what they're facing." Together, they moved through the streets, gathering the townsfolk in the old church, a relic itself, battered by time and neglect, but still standing as a beacon. Simon addressed the weary crowd, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. He spoke of the covenant, the ritual bindings, the sacrifices long buried beneath their feet, and the battle fought deep in the crypt. Some listened with wide eyes, others turned away, unwilling or unable to confront the horrifying truths that had shadowed their lives for generations. But Simon's warning was clear. The curse had not ended. The covenant's shadow still lurked, waiting for the next unwary soul to falter. As the gathering dispersed, Simon found himself alone with the journal once more. He flipped through the pages, searching for any clue that might offer hope, a way to sever the curse's root without sacrificing the town's soul. A passage caught his eye, faded and nearly illegible. To break the covenant is to invite the final reckoning. Only through sacrifice and understanding can the cycle be ended. Understanding. Sacrifice. Two words that echoed ominously in his mind. That night, as the town slept under a shroud of uneasy calm, Simon stood once more at the edge of the forest. The wind whispered secrets through the branches, voices old as time itself. The shadows danced in the moonlight, inviting, threatening. He knew what he had to do. Deep in the forest, where the trees grew dense and twisted, lay a hidden glade, a sacred place untouched by man for centuries. It was here the covenant had first been forged, and here Simon would face its true heart. Guided by the flickering light of his lantern and the pulse of the talisman at his side, Simon stepped into the clearing. The air hummed with raw power, and the earth beneath his feet seemed to pulse with life and death intertwined. In the center of the glade stood an altar carved from ancient stone, adorned with faded symbols of binding and protection. Around it, stones marked the graves of those who had given their lives to maintain the covenant, forgotten souls caught in an endless cycle of pain. Simon knelt, placing the talisman on the altar. His voice rose in a chant, words learned from the journal and whispered by the spirits themselves. The ground trembled as the ritual took hold, the air thickening with unseen forces. Suddenly, the shadows converged, coalescing into a figure both terrifying and familiar. It was the covenant incarnate, a monstrous being of darkness and light, pain and power, a reflection of every sacrifice made, every secret buried. Simon stood, heart pounding, facing the entity that embodied Coldwater's curse. The battle was not one of weapons or strength, but of will and sacrifice. "I accept the cost," Simon said, his voice unwavering. "For Coldwater's future, I will bear this burden." The entity's eyes glowed, and a searing pain shot through Simon's body, a consuming fire that threatened to devour his very soul. Yet, amidst the agony, a strange clarity emerged, the understanding of the covenant's true nature, the price of its hold on the town. As the ritual reached its climax, light and shadow entwined in a blinding conflagration. The earth shook, the forest screamed, and for a moment time itself seemed to hang suspended between salvation and damnation. When the light faded, Simon was alone. The altar cracked and silent, the oppressive weight lifted from the air, replaced by a fragile peace. But as he turned to leave, a whisper brushed against his ear, a voice not of menace, but of sorrow and warning. "The covenant may rest, but its shadow lingers. The true price has yet to be paid." Simon's blood ran cold. He was not free, not yet. And in the distance, beneath the shroud of night, a faint flicker of light pulsed, a sign that the covenant's final reckoning was still to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this chilling journey through Coldwater's dark past and the haunting legacy of the covenant. Your time and attention mean the world, especially when diving into stories that explore the thin line between our world and the unknown. If this story sent a shiver down your spine or kept you up at night, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale from the shadows. Your support helps keep these eerie stories alive and allows me to bring more terrifying legends to light. Remember, sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones lurking in the dark. They're the secrets buried deep within us and the places we call home. Stay safe, stay curious, and as always, watch your back. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Sweet nightmares.